25 to life.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be taking a look at how you can make your business more resilient to flooding and how to assess the risk and prioritise your actions. My name is Stephen Kennett, and I look after the Cities and Built Environment channels here at 2 Degrees. I'm delighted to welcome our presenters today. We have Dr. Nathan Richardson, Director at Atkins Water and Environment, and Kevin Owens, Principal Engineer, also from Atkins Water and Environment. Today's presentations will last around 35 minutes, which will leave us with 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. We'll also be running a poll throughout the webinar, which will appear on the right-hand side of your screen as a series of multiple-choice questions, and we will let you know when this is open for answering. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can submit questions throughout the presentations using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Just type in your question and press send, and then we'll wait till the end before answering as many as we can. As an aside, if you should have any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat box on the right-hand side to send me a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to Nathan, who's going to get us started with today's presentation. So Nathan, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nathan Richardson, and I'm a director at Atkins in the Water and Environment team. I'm interested in water risk management because water is one of our most precious fundamental resources, but we rarely give it the value it deserves. I'm concerned we're failing to fully recognise exposure of businesses and communities to water risk, particularly over the longer term. And today's webinar is about future-proofing business against flood risk. With me today is Kevin Owens from our flood risk management business in Atkins. The webinar today is going to be split into 5 sections. I'll provide a brief introduction as to why water risk is important to business, building on the webinar I gave on this topic in December last year. Kevin will then talk us through the risks that flooding can pose, some of the tools that we can use to assess flood risk, and also some of the steps that businesses can take to increase their resilience to flooding. And as Stephen highlighted, there's time for some questions and answers at the end of the presentations, and you can use the Q&A area on the right of the screen to submit questions at any time through the presentation. So why is water risk increasingly important to business? The world is a dynamic place. Throughout history, people have faced change and uncertainty around the future. However, the scale and the pace of change seems to be accelerating, and we're facing a number of global challenges that can change the way we live. Not only is the population rising, but how we choose to live is changing. People are increasingly concentrated into urban areas, and as urbanization rises and people live longer, we're faced with challenges over allocating scarce resources. More than a third of the world's population, about 2.4 billion people, live in water-stressed countries, for example. And by 2025, the number is expected to rise to 2/3. Up to 300 million people are directly affected annually by floods. Our physical environment is changing too. We know we'll experience some degree of climate change due to historic emissions and the lag in the climate system. And around the globe, we're going to have to adapt to changing temperatures and rainfall patterns, as well as more extreme events such as flooding. And around 2/3 of our cities are sited on the coast. Water cuts across all of this. It's fundamental to life, but competing demands and a changing climate present us with a challenge as to how we manage this resource and adapt to water risk in the future. And businesses have a key role to play. If we look specifically at the water challenge to business, we believe there are 4 different types of water risk. Physical risks, which are associated with not having the right amount of water at the right quality in the right place at the right time. So this might mean being unable to abstract water, or the flooding of a business premises, or water quality falling too low to be able to discharge wastewater. So we're currently working for one of the largest holiday villages in Europe, looking at its current and future vulnerability to flooding and designing a coast protection scheme to mitigate against future physical flood risk. Financial risks could result in businesses incurring increasing costs beyond purchasing water, such as rising insurance premiums or a loss of investor confidence. Investors are increasingly scrutinising how the businesses that they put their money into are exposed to water risk now and in the future. Reputational risks are associated with a negative perception of a company by the consumers or investors because of the way it handles or doesn't handle water risk in its global operations. An example would be a project we're doing at the moment where we're working for a major international minerals company, and we're helping them address stakeholder concerns around water and water pollution from their operations. The concerns were actually picked up by the media at a time when the company was expanding and looking to get listed on the stock exchange. So for them, the consequences of not addressing water risk were very significant. Finally, regulatory risks, and these are associated with current compliance and changes in the regulatory regime around water issues. So for example, the need to undertake flood risk assessments and mitigate impacts to secure development consents or planning permission. The costs to business when water risks materialise can be high. The floods in the UK this winter will cost more than £1 billion to clean up. And the Thai floods in 2011 resulted in more than $20 billion worth of damages. In fact, businesses in the UK are more likely to be flooded than burnt down, and the cost of flood damage is typically 4 times higher than the cost of fire damage. We believe that to adequately deal with water risks and flood risk, it's necessary to think in 4 dimensions. The first dimension, which I've already discussed, is breadth. The need to consider the range of risks that we face in making a case for action on water. The second dimension is spatial. There's a need to think about water risk beyond the factory gate. When we look at water, the level of risk faced is very much dependent on the catchment in which the business operates and where the activities take place. And this is certainly the case with flood risk and will be picked up in Kevin's part of the webinar. The third dimension is vertical. So looking at water risk through the lens of your suppliers, customers and investors, as well as your own operations. Your business might be indirectly exposed to water risk through the supply chain, and the level of exposure will depend on the complexity of the supply chain, where suppliers are located, and the type of goods and services they provide, and other factors such as their replaceability. So if you're truly to understand your exposure to water risk, you also need to look at how your suppliers and customers are affected by water issues. The final dimension is time, looking at how water risks may change through time. The CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project Water Report last year highlighted that about 2/3 of respondents expect water risks to impact their business in the next 5 years. However, relatively few businesses are looking at their resilience beyond this near-term horizon and integrating thinking on how they're going to adapt to and manage longer-term water risks, including flood risks, in their business strategies and investment plans. So what I've highlighted in this first part of the webinar is why businesses should be thinking about water risks, including their spatial, vertical and temporal dimensions, and using this understanding to inform business planning and business investment. Kevin's now going to go into more detail on flood risk in particular, looking at the risks that flooding can pose and the tools that we can use to assess flood risk and the steps that businesses can take to make themselves more resilient to flooding.
Thank you, Nathan, and good afternoon to all. Having now set the business context of the possible impacts of flooding, I just want to take a step back and review simply where did the floods come from. In recent months, the UK has seen a series of flooding events. In the USA, hurricane season affects low-lying areas with large established industrial areas, And across Asia, we've seen the widespread impacts of tsunami impacts over recent years, as well as large-scale rainfall events. But to be able to manage, and possibly more importantly, adapt to flooding, you need to have an idea really of the sources. On coastal areas, we have two main sources. Normal tidal levels can be scientifically predicted, with spring tides some 2 to 3 metres higher than mean tides, and typically local people are quite aware of when the tides will come up and over the harbours and the local infrastructure. Whereas the UK experienced in recent months, stormy weather and as a result the low air pressure can give rise to a surge in those tide levels. The winter storms in the UK saw surges about 1.2 metres higher than the actual spring tides which were occurring at the time. And to put that into context though, the storms in the UK back in January are forecast to have been a 5 to 10 year chance event. Put into a business context, a 10 to 20% chance occurring in every single year, and is that a risk you want to take where your operating margins are quite low? Coastal erosion can also be a problem if you're sited down near the coast. You've got that lovely view and that lovely vista, or you need access to ready amounts of water. But typically, wave energy can be coming up. It could dissipate on the foreshore and not cause a problem. It could erode inland and actually cause a problem to your access, such as you can see in the picture on your slide. Or it could come inland, over top it, flood defences you have in place, and erode them on the backside so that they eventually collapse, then giving you a problem. This caption here is very useful in at least identifying the red line here is the astronomical prediction of the tide, and the blue line, some 2 to 3 metres higher, was the actual tide level in Lowestoft last January during the period of the storm events. It gives you an idea of what the response you'd be looking at. Slightly obvious point, but too much rain will cause flooding. Now, historically, analysis in the UK, Europe and other major countries has focused on the larger rivers. That's where the main towns are, it's where the main settlements are, and it's the main economic activity is. But also, what happens then is the flooding happens as the flow in the river exceeds the channel capacity. And to put some context again back into the UK, typically the River Thames flows at 60 cubic metres a second through London. Back in January, it flowed at over 275 cubic metres a second for 50 consecutive days. That's enough water to fill an Olympic swimming pool every 4 seconds. Across the UK in 2002, across Europe in 2002 and across the UK in 2007, focus changed. Surface water flooding became an issue. A number of large storm events occurring. The surface water flooding is direct rainfall onto the ground having nowhere to go. That ground may already be completely soaking wet from previous rainfall events. And is then flowing all the maybe hard standing inbuilt areas, again as you can see in the picture on the slide. Groundwater flooding shouldn't be discounted either. The ambient groundwater levels, or the water table, may be sitting below ground. Now, historically, in large industrial areas, that water has been used for abstraction purposes, for industrial uses. That activity may now have stopped because those industries have gone away. Groundwater levels may now be an issue where they weren't in previous years. The flooding has an impact as well on people's livelihoods, people's welfare, people's way of life. As has already been noted, UK estimate the clean-up cost for the UK flooding this last winter is £1 billion. Now, at the government or federal level, damages are typically taken based on economic activity within that area. There's an inbuilt assumption if one location is flooded and at risk, that that economic activity will transfer to another location. So the GDP within that area is not affected. As a commercial business, however, that is you affected. And the economic change it can have on you could be direct or indirect. Staff will be losing time working. You may need to relocate to new space. You may need revised logistics because transport infrastructure is not the same. Smaller consignments, less bulk volume. and transport links are definitely going to be affected. People are also affected. There's obviously the stress of flooding occurring, or the worry of it occurring, and similarly, going back to the 4 concepts earlier, there's a business reputational risk. Again, to give you some headline numbers, 1 in 6 properties in the UK are at risk of flooding. Domestically, flooding up to less than 100 mil internally will cause about £10,000 of flooding. Flooding over skirting board level typically causes £40,000 in a domestic property. And within businesses, going back to damage, it's typically estimated about £200 a metre squared of commercial premises is the potential flood damage once flooding is inside that property. Significant trading loss, significant impact. The businesses normally take a minimum of 4 weeks to recover, and typically it's nearer 3 months. And at the same time, you have the wider community impacts on that community. Now at that point, I'd like to try and get the poll to work and ask you a number of questions. Now hopefully on the right hand side of your screen at the very top, you'll see the poll. I'd be grateful if you could just take a few seconds to answer those 3 questions. As to how has your organisation assessed its vulnerability to flood risk? Do you have a plan in place on the impact it would happen? And do you have a plan in place to manage the consequences of it? Just waiting for the answers to be processed. I can see the results on screen. I hope you can as well. Nobody seems to assess the vulnerability to flood risk to their business, and nobody also has a plan in place, so some are unsure. And do you have a plan in place to deal with the consequences? 1 in 3 of the respondents. Provide some idea. Commercial level is not only the issue of dealing with your own site, but also the issue of dealing with supply chain. Now we'll move on. What can you do to actually respond to those questions? There's a number of existing data sources publicly available in the UK, USA, EU, Australia, Caribbean, all being developed. These are all publicly available information from the various statutory bodies. Now the insurance industry have also been developing their own tools and their own systems. These are also widely available within the insurance industry, informing investment risk and informing the policies and aspects to be considered. There then comes a context of scale. It's a question of influence and effect at this point. As an individual employer or business, you have the greatest control and impact on your site at that micro level. However, the greatest opportunity may be available for you at a local or even national level, and the level of detail available at those points in time, at those scales, may differ. The different types of assessment will provide you with different levels of detail. Some of those technical assessments invariably includes modelling. It's physics. It's an analytical process. And for the modelling example, that you could do 1D modelling, which is a river channel, the conveyance capacity of that river. It's a simple process. It is a pure physics process. However, it's difficult to communicate across to your board or to your operational managers, and it can also be easy to challenge. 2-dimensional modelling may give you a greater visualisation, able to communicate the issue better, and using modern digital technology, GIS, BIM, etc., able to convey greater information, whether that be through the process, such as these images here show, of flooding causing and flowing down an area and causing, in this event, impacts to residential area. The commercial operation over on the right hand side of your screen, you can see, is not affected until then. These images can also be run as animation files, can be run as 3D values, can be overlain with Google imagery, etc. Output, though, from such analysis can also be used to inform investments, infrastructure planning, future development locations. This image on the screen here helps inform the local area about the potential flood risk, coastal erosion and tidal flooding, where to locate those new developments, essentially how long will they last for, what is the sustainability process. That's the theory. How do you actually put it into practice is the second question, I suppose. The following slides give you the concept from a real life example. It's a project I've been involved in a number of years. It's one we've had to bring a number of these items into the process. But what are those items? Well, your actions can actually come in a number of ways. Structural. Build it higher, build it out of the way, build it so it won't get flooded in the first place. Non-structural. Can you do something to divert that flow, or do something that helps you reduce the flow, or make your building more resilient, have all your stock up at higher levels, for example. And operational is, can you actually avoid your asset being affected in the first place? Swansea is a medium-sized city in the southwest of Wales. About 30 years ago, there's an area to the north of it that got designated as an enterprise zone. Large commercial retail development. Covers at the moment some 300 hectares with a potential expansion by another 50%. As you can see on the image over on your left hand side of your screen, a significant area of it is currently at flood risk. That's the light blue. Currently there's a block on development of subsequent phases and subsequent investment as a result. And as a result there's a number of economic implications. Now, we developed a series of options that provided the business case for the local authority to secure some match funding of European investment of nearly £7 million. As part of that process, we brought in some operational measures. One of the actions was, can we reduce the consequence of flooding? And the intention here was, can we alter supply chain responses? Can we alter the business responses? Through providing an early warning process and detection from the statutory authorities, that transferring down to a warning process at local authority level, and the action and the intention for the emergency responders to have in place diversion routes and evacuation procedures. What's happened as the project's evolved, it's become a warning and informing programme. The programme has been put in place to have in place local flood plans by the businesses on the event of receiving the warnings. So the businesses are able to put into place the actions and initiate the processes to reduce their logistics, delay deliveries. Do they need staff to be coming in the next day, for example? We've raised awareness that 90% of the businesses in that area have now signed up to the flood warning system. Through the local business forums, we've actually initiated a number of discussions to highlight, and exactly like this process is doing, raise awareness. At the moment in time, it's still to be tested because fortunately the rainfall has not been too bad in recent times in this area. You're then on to, can you do structural actions? This is an example of a flood defence wall that was actually provided by a major retailer. It ties into additional flood defences for a wider part of this city. This was funded separately by the retailer as part of their redevelopment of that area. More established city centre location. You can see here a facility which raises as a surface water flooding in this part of the area occurs. This frontage can come up, protects the building. During normal operating processes, that appears as a plain pavement. And this is an example of the northwest of England, first major one in the UK. It's alongside residential area where these barriers essentially float up with flood levels and prevent the residential area from flooding. In Swansea, the solution we developed over on the left hand side of your screen, the multicolour picture, shows areas flooding. The blue areas flood more frequently, possibly a 1 in 10 event, 10% chance of that occurring. Through the solutions we've adopted over on your right hand side, this has now been reduced down to a 1% chance, which is considered acceptable, it's manageable and it's allowable. There are still areas at risk, however they are significantly reduced. allowing investment and economic activity to grow. Non-structural aspects, what can you do? Well, you can influence others at a regional level, at a local level, through that local business forum, through those local supply chains, and at a regional level, through your statutory bodies, through those context partners. There may be issues on the ground where you have issues, and there may be solutions on a shelf somewhere which are seeking input, that need to be unlocked. That cooperation in Swansea has ended up involving the emergency services, local authority councillors and elected members, the statutory body, national government and EU funding teams, and the local business communities and the local residents. A number of parties to bring to the table for a discussion. We wait to see if the plan changes and the approaches provide the intended benefits. As I say, usually we only will find out if things haven't worked when they haven't worked. I think in summary, poses a number of risks to the businesses. You need to first understand that risk and understand, do you have an issue both yourself at your site and also your supply chain need to manage? And if so, do you have the operational changes in place to actually recover and be more resilient against flooding in the future? Now I'll hand back to the main host and we take any questions.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So that was a great overview and insight there. So we will now kick off the question and answer session. And maybe to begin with, Nathan, this is perhaps one you'd like to tackle, but question we've got is, how can I make a business case to my board to invest in looking at flood risk?
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. This is
I can hear you, Nathan.
That's fine. Just battling with the technology. This is actually quite a common question that comes up when people are looking to seek approval for investing in action on water. It often comes up when in connection with investing in water use efficiency, where the low cost of water can make it difficult to make an investment case based just on the value of the water that's saved. So when this question comes up, we usually recommend to businesses they look more broadly at the range of water risks that they face: financial, regulatory, physical, reputational, and what the cost would be if those risks materialised. And these costs that you can avoid are generally well in excess of anything that you can justify just based on water savings. But in terms of flood risk specifically, the case for action is generally a lot easier to make, especially if your operations or those of your supply chain are at flood risk. So as Kevin highlighted, you can get hold of maps that show the extent and likely frequency of flood events, and you can combine that with data on the typical cost of a flood to business. So you can quite quickly pull together quite a compelling case for some funding for some further action to look at flood risk exposure in a bit more detail, and then if appropriate to draw up a flood plan.
Great, thank you, Nathan. A sort of follow-up question to that, someone's asking, are there funds in the UK to help finance flood alleviation measures specifically for businesses? Do you
want to pick this one up, Kevin?
Yeah, sure. I wouldn't say there's sums available for personal as in direct business benefits. What I would say in the UK is, for example, if a business has available investment monies where they are thinking an investment, but maybe doesn't solve their whole question, there's definitely a contribution which they'll be able to provide to the Environment Agency through the process, because possibly the Environment Agency have something in the pipeline themselves for which they're seeking contributions. And by getting that contribution, they're able to actually deliver that option on the ground.
So the government in the UK are prepared to invest a certain amount in flood defence. Often that isn't quite enough to allow certain schemes to go ahead. So if the local community and the businesses that are benefiting from those investments can get together, they can unlock some of those schemes and tap into the money that's available from government.
Great, thank you, Nathan. Another question we've got come in the US is increasingly looking at floodplain restoration to natural and beneficial functions that attenuate flooding downstream. Is there anything similar happening in the UK? Nathan, do you maybe want to tackle that one first?
It's quite a hot topic in the UK. Many of the people on the line followed the flooding during the winter. There was quite a hot debate around flooding up in the upland area down in Somerset, and that area being allowed to flood to help protect an urban area, Bridgewater, downstream. So, I mean, floodplain management and the use of upland areas to mitigate flood risk to urban areas is already practiced in the UK as well as in the United States. It is quite a common feature of most of the catchments we've got over here. That doesn't mean it can't be contentious. If you're a farmer owning land in the upland area that gets flooded, then as we saw in the winter floods, it can be have quite an impact on your operations and on your businesses if you're the sort of sacrificial area to protect an urban area downstream.
Great, thank you. Kevin, a question here. You recommend preparing a flood plan. What sort of things would that plan include? Could you maybe give a bit of insight into that?
Sure, yeah. Not dissimilar to any other emergency or non-routine event contingency plan that the business probably has in place. It's just understanding what it means in the context of flood risk. In the UK context, it may be as simple as having awareness of the other flood maps from the flood extents that are available publicly, dry access routes, emergency contact numbers, both for your key staff and key holders and your service responders, whether that be glazing, plumbing, etc. Those sort of aspects. Again, it depends on the complexity of the business.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Another question that's come in. How real is the risk of properties becoming obsolete due to unacceptable flood risk? And there's a kind of follow-up question to that, which is how might it impact on your insurance premiums, and how do you open up dialogue with your insurance provider if you undertake a flood risk plan?
I need to pick that one up.
Kevin, do you maybe want to tackle that one first?
Sure. More probably around the insurability and affordability of that property, whether that be a row of terraced properties, residential properties, or whether that be a large business infrastructure where it comes down to commercial acceptability of the risk. The example I showed you on screen earlier of that flood defence wall built by that commercial business, that car park has to be allowed to flood due to the planning conditions during, I think it was a 1 in 10 flood event. So commercially, that business cannot operate in that event. How might it impact on insurance premiums? Again, if you're able to demonstrate to your insurance provider or broker, it has the ways there of at least assuring that insurance broker that your business resilience has improved and implicitly your risk has improved. In the UK, the last few years, they've had the statement of principles in place where the insurance industry would carry on providing affordable cover where areas are provided a certain amount of flood defences. That's now changed. There's a flood RE mechanism coming in, which will continue to apply risk and continue to apply insurance in high risk areas subject to certain criteria, but won't be applied to new development. Insurers are always looking at different options. They will consider flood resilience being built in. There's a current inbuilt challenge of how they consider betterment following a flood event occurring as to who should pay for that improved resilience to your property.
Great, thank you, Kevin. There's another question just following up on your presentation. The measures that you mentioned in Swansea, who takes ownership of those and who manages those?
That was an interesting one. For Swansea in particular, the local authority, if you like, with the initial sponsor or the initial sort of party taking that forward on an economic regeneration level. Legislatively, in the location they are, the Environment Agency was where the statutory body who had the powers to actually provide those flood defence works. So at government level, it was then assigned really that it was up to the Environment Agency to promote the works and take on those works on the back of the money that the local authority had secured. So ultimately, it was the Environment Agency that took on the measures, with the local authority gaining the benefit. Essentially, all public money, but assigned to different parties.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Nathan, I'm not sure if you want to pick this one up, but what sort of timescale are you looking at for pulling together a flood risk plan?
I think it depends on the level of information that is out there for the locations that you're interested in. So if, for example, you've got access to flood risk plans, then it can be done quite quickly. It could be done, just in a matter of days. Get hold of the relevant plans, look at the level of risk in context with your business locations and operations. Maybe have a look at and then that will inform where you need to focus your efforts. So I think initially, it's probably quite a quick exercise to do, just to screen your operations and sites for their potential exposure. And then when you get into the plan, a lot of it, as Kevin said, might be transferable from existing emergency resilience plans that you may have already for those locations, but it may just need a sort of flood risk proofing, you could say, to ensure that your responses, if a flood event were to happen, are set out and sort of captured in that plan. So I think initially probably talking about something that's just a few days. Beyond that, if you get into modelling, then that could take a little bit longer to set that up. But it's not a particularly onerous task to make sure that flood risk is part of your sort of business resilience planning. And it may well, going through the process, it may well identify that there are some opportunities where you can collaborate with others to reduce your flood risk exposure, or where you can lobby local responsible bodies to progress a scheme that provides greater protection.
Great, thank you, Nathan. And one final question here, Kevin, you might like to tackle this one, but what can I do about flood risk where the solutions aren't directly in my control? Have you got some advice around that?
I think that one comes back to the sort of lobbying and influencing others aspects. It's actually getting all those parties around the table, which isn't a straightforward task. It does take time. Normally involves some political influencing as well. It's obviously, if you're in the UK, it's through your Environment Agency contacts. In the US, probably through FEMA or EPA colleagues, and it's being part of that conversation. You as the person at risk with a commercial aspect may have the priming budget to actually at least get something moving off the ground. Others may be able to deliver that, but you having that initial funding startup may actually help. I think that's the key thing there, is actually you may have the access to financial aspects which the the public bodies haven't got access to.
So I think, Kevin, those structural solutions may involve quite a few parties coming together to work together and to co-fund the solution. I think some of the operational things that Kevin talked about, probably, when you actually look at them, they are more in your control.
Great, thank you, Nathan. So we're going to wrap up now, but I'd like to thank Nathan and Kevin for their time today and for getting through so many questions, and also for everyone who's joined us for this webinar. Just to remind you all that a recording of the webinar and the presentation slides will be archived on the 2 Degrees platform, and as soon as those go live, I'll send out a link. So I hope you found today useful and interesting, and you'll be able to join us for more webinars in the coming months. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.